Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor, the host for this podcast, which details the most important events, people, and ideas in the history of the Catholic Church, which have become controversial or have been controversial in its history. If you like our podcast, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. Go to the channel there. Spotify has taken over Anchor, is now my podcast platform. You can go find all of our former episodes free there. However, if you want to get new episodes, some episodes will be free for everybody, but new episodes continuously, you can go subscribe on my Patreon page. I have 3 levels of subscription: $5, $7, and $10. Mostly, by the way, the episodes will be free, but you can go there and subscribe. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and on the web, churchcontroversies.com. I have a website. So I'll post things from time to time, announcements about stuff. So it's all there. Go check it out. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to subscribers. Appreciate it. It's very humble that you want to contribute to this effort of mine. And today we have a little bit of a different item for you. This is a re-recording of an episode I've already done, but it was an episode I did when this wasn't a podcast. It was an episode back when I was doing this as a talk for my local parish, and the recording wasn't the greatest, so you can't hear it that well. At least some of these I'm going to re-record, and this is the first of these re-recordings. And the title of this is The Reformation of the World, the Gregorian Reform, circa 1050 to 1150. If you've never heard of it, it's fascinating history in the medieval period. So, again, like the podcast and everything, go and subscribe and all that stuff. And tell people about the podcast. Keep spreading the word. I'm trying to do better advertising for this. And there's a lot of episodes you can go back. You don't have to subscribe or anything. You can go get in for free. So let people know about that. But anyway, we are talking about the Gregorian Reform. And what is that? And why do I call it the Reformation of the world? Because it's one of the more significant reform movements in the history of the Western Catholic Church. It takes place in the Middle Ages. And it was a reform movement that emerged out of the situation of the church in the early part of the Middle Ages after the end of the Carolingian Empire. If you recall, the empire of Charlemagne, who briefly in the 9th century sort of creates a European-wide empire. Briefly, it kind of falls apart in a few decades after his life, which kind of pushes Western Europe into being a more feudal type of society. But it also leads to what will become, at least in the minds of these reformers, problems in the period after, in the 10th and then the early 11th centuries, which will lead to this reform movement, which I guess still today you could see it's controversial in some ways. And this reform movement, just to set this out at the outset, had 3 goals, all of which they achieved. One of those was freedom from lay power, to get the church out of the control of the nobility, who basically ran it for reasons that will become apparent after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. Local nobility did things like appoint parish priests. Why? Because it's a feudal society, and it's on their land, it's in their gift, and so you get these nobility who are appointing parish priests. You get them, effectively, you get kings effectively appointing bishops. And so it falls in practice into their hands, and they think this is wrong, only the church will be able to appoint its priests and bishops. The second goal of all this was the reform of the clergy, for reasons that will come up apparent. Both the conduct of the clergy, but also the status of the clergy in the minds of these reformers is it's unacceptable for reasons that will become apparent. And then finally, the third aspect of this reform movement was to reassert the primacy of the papacy over the entire church. And we have to understand something here. The reason why this comes into conflict in this period is that in the early part of the Middle Ages, because this is going to be directed at, when I say free the church from lay control, I mean the control of nobility and kings. And, kings in the early Middle Ages were sacred figures. Most kings saw their duties to their subjects as obligations imposed upon them by God to punish the oppressors, to protect the helpless, to spread the word of God to their pagan neighbors, sometimes by violence. This could be asserted in ways that were, obviously contrary to Christian faith to a certain degree, and sometimes in periods of disorder when they needed to, gain control of things. But it was a very powerfully held ideal, especially in the former Carolingian kingdoms of France, the Holy Roman Empire, well as Spain. And so you have these kings, and the kings, by the way, from an early period, I want to say the 5th, 6th century, are being anointed like Old Testament kings were. So people, both they and their subjects, see them as sacred figures. And so they don't really see any problem with them governing the church like that. Why not? They're Christians too. But it's this type of action, especially, again, where kings are, kings and nobility are the only patrons of churches, of monasteries, financially. They've become to dominate them by not only bestowing the lands because they own the land, they bestow, more crucially, offices on clerics by right of gift. If you know how feudal society works, it's basically you find a noble lord or a powerful lord, and you swear fealty to him. He agrees to protect you. In return, he expects stuff from you. This is how this worked in the church in this period, and it's this type of thing that these reformers are aiming at in some regards. So where do all these ideas come from in this period? Well, it really begins in monastic realm. In particular, following the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, you begin to have reforms within the Benedictine monasteries of Western Europe. The rule of Saint Benedict had kind of fallen into abeyance by the 9th century, but again is restored throughout that century by the example and teaching of Benedict of Aniane, who was a monk associated with the reforms of Charlemagne. And there was this move to re-emphasize the rule of Benedict in its strictness. And this will become a theme here, as we're going back to origins, going back to, what these Gregorian reformers will call later on in the 11th century, the Ecclesia Primitiva, going back to the origins. And it's an attempt to strictly adhere to monastic discipline, but also a shift in the way they practice it, because this man, Benedict of Aniane, put great emphasis on the recitation of the monastic office. And so a lot of these monasteries came to put, prayer over manual labor. And this is partly because these monasteries were increasingly became regarded by lay Christians as primarily as intercessors to God. Lay patrons would donate land and wealth to these monasteries. They would pray for their souls in response. And so contemplative intercessory prayer came to be seen as the primary purpose of monastic life in this regard. So you have this shift. You also have a shift in terms of the way these things are structured, in that the famous monastery at Cluny is founded in 909, and it's important because the House of Cluny becomes also does something that's innovative. Its abbots are so successful, it begins to plant various daughter houses across France and Germany in the 11th and the 12th centuries, and this is an innovation in terms of Christian monasticism, either east or west. Before this, all monastic houses, foundations have been independent entities, but now numerous ones existed whose primary allegiance was not to their own abbot or local bishop, but to the abbot of the mother house. And so this again gives some exemption from local episcopal jurisdiction, but it also becomes a source of appeal if the bishop or local lord becomes too oppressive. And increasingly, what I'm getting at here is that these houses become more and more independent. The Cluny houses were generally friendly to kings, but kings were wary of them precisely because they were founded as independent centers and therefore outside of their immediate control for ultimately these monasteries and their mother house. Eventually, especially, and this is the key thing, happens at the end of this period, end of the 1080s onward in the 11th century, they'll eventually appeal to the Bishop of Rome to have their privileges renewed by the Pope, and become subject only to him. So they'll become a focus of independence from lay authority. The other thing about this is that these reformers, again, because they put so much emphasis on reforming the discipline, going back to more austere forms of monasticism, you began to have, because older monasteries had been closely connected to society, and this meant that so many times their monks had been admitted by their parents as children, or they were monks who became shortly before their death so they could benefit from the prayers of the community. This seemed worldly to these newer foundations who wanted a more austere spirit, who want to separate themselves from the world. And so it begins a long tradition, which is totally absent in the Eastern world, of reformed religious orders. For example, those founded at, for example, Situ in 1098, the Cistercians as they came to be called, intentionally settled in remote places and reintroduced manual labor in the simplified liturgy in their houses. Same time, 1084, roughly same period, 1084, St. Bruno founds the Carthusians at Chartreuse in France. Again, hoping to restore the purity of the order, he didn't give his followers a rule. The point here is they want to see a distinction between the monastic life as the ideal of a Christian life and life in the world. This will deeply influence the Gregorian reformers, because some of them will come out of these monasteries. This is something, by the way, if you don't know, traditionally, at least in most of Christian history, West and East actually, lots of times reform movements in the church come from the monastic world. And the last thing that these newer reformed religious orders had in common, they tended to emphasize beliefs that were potentially explosive. One of these, and this is, I believe the Cistercians were actually known for this, was the idea that men's obligation to God was prior to that of their earthly superiors. This idea had existed before, but they emphasize it. But also, and this is the key thing, is that the clerical state itself was superior to lay pursuits in a way that just, again, that idea is there from the beginning, but or from an earlier period, but the idea that they really emphasize this lay states, the clerical states superior to the lay. And again, this is aimed at partly these nobility, these kings who control the church. And this reforming spirit is going to catch fire, particularly in the 11th century, as we're going to see. And I'll mention a few people here, a few Italians in Italy, because it's important for the papacy. A couple of important people. One is St. Peter Damian. If you probably know him, he's usually associated with his book, it's a series of letters condemning sodomy among the clergy. But he's from Ravenna in northern Italy, and there's a monastic life in 1043 there. And he implements in this monastery what he took to be these Benedictine reforms, but he turns his pen to issues of church reform, two of which are really important for the reform of the clergy. That's what he's really important for here, is if the Benedictines were partly about, freeing from lay influence to a certain degree, Peter Damian and his ilk are concerned about the clergy, the regular clergy. And one of these things is simony, right? Simony is the buying and selling of church offices. This is seen as a consequence of lay control, consequence of being part of this feudal society they live in. And so they're attacking, by the way, one of the tenets of this feudal society by saying, no, you can't do that about the clergy. They can't do that with the offices of the church, by the way, because they're holy. You shouldn't treat holy things like that. The other part they're attacking, St. Peter Damian, as well as one of his comrades, is Umberto Silva Candida, also writes extensively against simony. He attacks, does Peter Damian, the tradition of clerical concubinage. And again, there's two reasons for this. One is worried about the moral standards of the clergy. Also because, again, they view, to these reformers, the clerical state as being superior to, more pure than the lay state. Sex, being in the world is impurity. The other thing, of course, is that this system, if you have clerical marriage, that means they can sort of marry into these lay families. They're connected to these noble families. And so that's a concern, that's part of the concern. But also, of course, it's contrary to a tradition of clerical celibacy in the Roman Church. This goes back to the 4th century. It's ancient. So they're trying to assert all this stuff, or people like Peter Damian and Silva Candida. One thing to mention about this sometimes is portrayed, again, especially by progressive theologians and things of this nature, that this is a clericalist thing that's imposed on, Christian laity. Not totally, because the drive for clerical celibacy had lay support. Remember I mentioned earlier that, laymen tended to see now the church increasingly as a privileged intercessor with God. They became concerned about the impurity of priests. And so you would have people who actually were on board with this. There was a movement, for example, in the 11th century in the city of Milan in Italy called the Paderines. And this name took its name from a group of laymen who preached, literally, sometimes preached out in the open against the immorality of the clergy. And with the support, by the way, as we're going to see, popes, like one pope we'll get to in a moment, Gregory VII, Gregory VII, the pope where we get this name, Gregorian Reform, from, actually encouraged them to drive out the Bishop of Milan. So this is potentially almost subversive. So you have this drive for purity, which is not merely a clerical imposition. So you have wanting to free from lay control, you have wanting to reform the clergy. The last aspect of this, of course, is the reassertion of papal authority. Why would you need to reassert papal authority in the 11th century? So why would you need to reassert papal authority? Well, you need to reassert papal authority in the 11th century because it basically fell off the face of the earth in the 10th. Following the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the papacy sunk into one of its lowest points, actually. A lot of bad popes, a lot of corrupt people. A later 19th century Protestant historian named Ludwig Pastor coined the papacy, the term pornocracy to describe the papacy of the 10th century. It became the plaything of ambitious nobles and emperors. Particularly the Ottonian emperors of the 10th century had to go into Rome. They actually got popes off the throne and put their own ones on there. And so it was an age of weakness, from the 10th century up to the early mid 11th century, such that by the time you get to the middle of the 11th century, you have, emperors. And I mentioned emperor. What is the emperor? Emperor is, of course, the successor kingdom state to Charlemagne's empire. We sometimes call it the Holy Roman Empire. It's a later term. They never used that term in official documents. It's just called the empire. But it's his successor kingdom. And they particularly became, used to a couple of things. One, interfering in papal elections, but also appointing their own bishops. And so by the time you get to the middle of the 5th century, you have really nadir in some ways in the 1030s. You have, in the year 1082, after 1032, in the next couple of dozen years or so, there are 3 anti-popes. And so by the time 1046 rolls around, the emperor at the time, Henry III, has a free hand to appoint the next pope, which he does. And but he's a reformer, Henry III was. And in fact, again, this is something to note about this, is that in this period when the papacy is at its nadir, who's helping the church? It is kings, especially the emperors. They're actually on the side of reform in a lot of ways. But what happens in 1048 is that this first pope that Henry III appointed dies, and in his stead he has Bruno of Toul, a French bishop, consecrated as Pope Leo IX, and he's a kinsman of Henry III, but he's also a dedicated reformer who shares the ideals of these Benedictine reformers, and he will bring with him people to Rome who are all these reformers. Peter Damian's one of his advisors. Another one is a German monk named Hildebrand, who become a key advisor, and they're all fired by these ideals, of freedom from lay control, reform the clergy, but they also want to reassert the authority of the papacy. And with the reforms that begin during the reign of Henry III, the emperor, the papacy begins to assert its independence. After 1046, popes begin to travel outside of Italy to intervene in disputes with bishops. They begin to summon church councils and issue decrees for reforms in local churches. And they begin investigating abuses and encouraging appeals to the papacy. The popes begin to send out cardinals and legates to mediate disputes, often to the chagrin of local bishops who've gotten used to not having this happen. But in particular, you're going to have the papacy begin to assert its independence, and particularly in the period from 1059 onward, they hold a series of synods and especially the ones in 1059 and 1060 are really crucial. Nicholas II is the Pope at the time. And in 1059, they hold the Lateran Synod of 1059 issues a decree restricting the right of electing a new Pope only to cardinals in Rome. Why do you say this? Because that effectively nullifies the right of the emperor to intervene. In other words, they're trying to free themselves from the control of the emperors. They also issue decrees forbidding any priest from accepting a church from a layman. That's attacking simony. They also issue decrees barring priests from living in concubinage from celebrating the sacraments. Again, the idea is this makes them impure. And then they also commanded the faithful not to assist unworthy ministers. So they're encouraging the lay faithful to get away from what they thought were impure priests. And then finally, they begin to exalt the papacy, do the sort of advisors around these popes in the middle of the 11th century. The idea is that they put forth is that that power of the church flows from the Pope downward. It flows from the Roman Church or the Pope to the rest of the church. Sometimes the two are blurred. Writers such as Hildebrand and others begin exalting papacy as the sole source of the power in the church as the 1050s. And this idea will set the sort of rhetorical parameters for what happens later. They begin making assertions that, for example, that it's heresy to disobey the Pope. Again, these things are kind of novel in the 11th century. And the reason they're doing this, by the way, is because at this point, Damien and people like Peter Damien and Hildebrand think that real reform of the clergy and of the church can only happen if you get rid of lay control, and that can only happen through the papacy. And so they assert his power, because most of these things have been asserted before. I don't mean to emphasize the novelty here at all, but the way they're asserted is very strident and different for a variety of reasons that will become clear in a moment. And so in 1073, Hildebrand, the monk, becomes Gregory VII, the Pope. And he's famous for the so-called conflict of investitures, or the investiture controversy. And it's controversial because of the way he asserts papal authority. And one of the most famous documents associated with his reign is the so-called Dictatus Papae, which is a sort of list of headings for organizing ancient canons, which, as far as we can tell, by the way, and this needs to be said, was never distributed, never circulated, never used for anything. There are no direct references to this document and anything else that Gregory VII wrote. It's only occasionally mentioned by canon lawyers later on. But they're kind of extraordinary, these statements that are made in this document, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that asserted. And it asserted, for example, among other things, that the Roman Church was, quote unquote, founded by the Lord alone, that the Roman Church has not erred, cannot err, will never err, that the Pope cannot be judged by anyone, legally speaking, that his legates, who are representatives across all Christendom, took precedence over all local authority. The Pope, therefore, had the authority to depose bishops alone. He could make law and deliver judgments for which no appeal could be made. And he could also do this. This is the explosive thing here. He's overlord of secular princes. He could depose secular princes. At least some of the things in there make clear that he could, if they disagree with the Roman Church. Again, I should mention, these are bald statements, not qualified, and not actually emphasized by Gregory VII, but more or less is the general idea that basically the Pope is the ruler of the entire Christian world. And basically, his theory basically is that the papacy is of divine origin. He's the only intermediary in the church between man and God, charged with making known the will of the Trinity and of the apostles Peter and Paul. Now, when I say all this, by the way, let me be clear about something. He's not saying, Gregory didn't assert that the institution of the papacy itself was somehow segregated from tradition. There was a good historian years ago named Carl Morrison, an Anglican, by the way, I think a priest, wrote a book called Tradition in the Western Church, 300 to 1100. And he pointed out, as we're going to get here in this investiture controversy, both sides in this controversy appeal to tradition. Pope Gregory VII thought he was just reasserting the ancient tradition of the Roman Church. And he appealed and justified his very, very, very strong claims to authority in those terms. But they'd never been quite made this way before. And so one of the things that the hills that he's willing to die on, this again comes from these reformers, is that they want free and canonical elections of bishops. And by free, they mean, of course, free from free from imperial influence. And of course, emperors would resist this. But however, during the early years of his reign, the emperor at the time, Henry IV, he came to the throne as a minor. So in the early years of his reign, he didn't have a lot of control in the empire over his church, and in fact, the papacy regained a lot of control over the church and the empire. Now, what happened is, as soon as he came to the throne, Henry IV started to try to reclaim some of that authority, and this is where he comes into conflict with Gregory VII. And he claimed, did Henry IV, a right to choose bishops without regard to the church and to invest them with their clerical office. And this is what, of course, butts heads with Gregory VII, who Hildebrand was a real fiery person, as you can kind of imagine. And this happens as early as 1074, some 1075, and this leads to a split between the princes of Germany who support the Pope and those who support Henry, who was soon, several times actually, excommunicated by Gregory VII. And what's going to happen, by the way, because of this, is you're going to have civil conflict throughout the empire for the better part of the next 50 years. It causes a lot of damage, does this conflict in the 1070s. And so there's a rebellion against Henry by his princes, but by 1075, he has already gained the upper hand over them and begins investing bishops with their authority again. In response, Gregory issues another admonition, basically threatens him with excommunication if he doesn't stop. He holds a synod, does Gregory, in 1075 in Rome, which condemned lay investiture. In response, Henry holds an imperial synod in Worms, which declared Gregory VII not to be the Pope, which ended with the call to descende in Latin, come down, in other words, resign from the papacy. And finally, Gregory has had enough. In 1076, he excommunicates Henry IV. And by the way, does something else that's also really explosive. He basically says his vassals are released from their oaths of allegiance to Henry. The popes claimed basically to be able to say that, okay, you're a subject of the King of France. If I say so, you no longer have to obey his authority. Just imagine how what that kind of does. Well, it caused another rebellion, actually, is what it did. And of course, this time things didn't go so well for Henry IV. And so the Pope in 1077 flees north to a castle in the mountains of Canossa, at Canossa in northern Italy. And Henry made his way down there. We're not really sure about this. We're not really sure how this goes down, because on the one hand, the Pope seems to be fleeing from, Henry's going with an army into Italy, by the way. But Henry makes his way to Canossa, apparently dressed in the dress of a penitent seeking absolution. And the Pope hesitated. And the reason why is, part of the reason he excommunicated him in the first place is, of course, now that he's outside the church, that gives him leverage over Henry. However, coming to him dressed as a penitent, begging for absolution, which is apparently what he did, he had no choice. After 3 days, he allowed Henry to enter the castle, accepted his submission, and absolved him. But he was, of course, right to be suspicious because, again, rebellious princes in Germany elected an anti-king, a guy named Rudolph of Swabia. And so he going back to war again in Germany. And of course, Henry went back on his words, now investing bishops again. So the Pope excommunicates Henry again in 1080. Henry IV responds by having imperial bishops elect an anti-pope at Ravenna. Later that year in 1080, he does Henry, Rudolph of Swabia, in battle, who dies of his wounds. And so by 1081, he's defeated his enemies in Germany. In 1081, he brings his army to Rome and conducts a 3-year siege of the city. And then in 1084, he will enter and basically drive Gregory into exile, install his anti-pope as Clement III. And Gregory will appeal to his Norman allies, actually his vassals. The Norman kings of Sicily were actually vassals of the papacy. causes a lot of damage. They try to recapture the city. They fail. And instead, Gregory VII dies in exile in 1085 at Salerno, kind of embittered. He's supposed to have said on his deathbed or close to his death, I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile, quoting the psalm there. His successor, Urban II, would successfully drive the anti-pope out of Rome, and the struggle with his sons, with Henry IV between his sons, with his sons in Germany, however, his sons rebelled against him, would consume the rest of Henry's life till he dies in 1106. But this didn't end the conflict. The same issues reared their heads again in several different places, not just in the empire. This time in England, 1102, for example, between Henry I, the brother of William the Conqueror, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, over Henry's appointment of bishops. Over a period of several years, 5 years, they wrangle. They finally come to an agreement in 1107 called the Concordat of London, in which they compromised. Henry would cease to invest bishops with spiritual powers, but he would still demand homage from them as vassals, as subjects, and grant them their feudal temporalities, their property. But Henry I was still free to choose bishops without reference to the church. So that domino doesn't fall there. You have some precursors of this in France as well. That only comes into the picture in 1122, when the Concordat of Worms is signed by Henry V, the emperor at the time, and Pope Calixtus II. And it follows, by the way, this had been suggested decades earlier by, I can't remember the churchman's name, but it basically granted the church the right of choosing the candidate, but allowed the emperor some influence in that he was to be present at their consecration. In other words, he could be there to intimidate them, or at least have some influence like, hey, I'm here, you can't just do whatever you want. And by the way, you couldn't just a king could not just sit by and let the church choose someone who was inimical to him. So he had to have some influence. But the other thing they did was this, along with the separation of feudal temporalities, feudal lands from ecclesiastical office, meant now you could draw a clear legal distinction between the church and the temporal authorities. And for the first time, and this, by the way, be clear, is not separation of church and state. It's still officially a Christian kingdom. They still refer to Christianity all the time. But as legal entities, they are now distinct things. And one last note about this, and again, would date this to the end of the Gregorian Reform to about 1150 or so. It took much longer to free the lower clergy from lay control. They had advocated things like these Gregorian reformers, people around Gregory VII and others, the election of bishops by cathedral chapters, again, to free them from noble influence, but also the appointment of priests by bishops. Again, priests, had been appointed by, noblemen and stuff like this. By the middle of the 12th century, by the 1150s, the appointment, these two things have taken hold in most places. So, in other words, by the middle of the 12th century, definitely by the end of the 12th century, the reforms they had wanted are more or less enacted. And so it is successful are the Gregorian reforms in that regard. So what are the consequences of all this? And why is this? This sounds good, right? The church triumphed. It got separation from the laity. What happened? Why is this a controversial thing? One thing to talk about here is that sometimes some scholars have referred to a papal revolution, because the Gregorian reformers made so many claims to the papacy to, judge, legal cases, all of this stuff, that it increased the size of papal government. In the ensuing centuries, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, a series of institutions, the church had created a series of institutions to ensure the workings of the Pope's interests. A chancery to issue documents, a treasury which housed archives and library of documents, so you could issue things like papal bulls. By the mid-12th century, the College of Cardinals was something like a court in its own right. And the Curia itself was a massive legal operation because it would receive pilgrims, to Rome for, feast days and stuff like that. But also litigants going to the papal court, hoping for a favorable judgment. People would come to Rome. And the creation of these structures made the medieval papacy the largest and most sophisticated institution in Europe. The only thing, and it really wasn't a lot of ways, the only thing like a real bureaucracy in a modern sense, and it really wasn't, but it was the closest thing. And And it was Urban II at the end of the 11th century who first began to reorganize and centralize the administrative apparatus of the papacy as well. All this, by the way, went in along with another thing that comes out of these reforms. Is the call for crusade, by the way. Urban II is the one who called the first crusade at Clermont in 1096, which again, the popes begin to see their role as a universal governor of the entire Christian world. They begin acting on it, and that's part of that. Another thing that happens, because this growth of the papacy, you also have the increasing importance of canon law. This is kind of a sort of indirect consequence of the sort of high claims that Gregory VII and his successors made for the papacy and the church. Again, the idea that the church had a unique divine authority that transcended any merely human bonds, feudal, tridal, familial. That's basically what they were saying with regards to these secular. They're basically trying to desacralize monarchy, saying, no, you don't actually have any divine authority over these things. Only the church does. And that's a pretty, when you say that, and then you say that the church alone can legislate for itself, again, it makes necessary the growth of an administration to handle all those activities, because it was involved in almost everything in medieval life. At the same time this is happening in the 11th and 12th centuries, Roman law is being resurrected in medieval universities as an object of studies, and so Roman law is used to create a legal system, which we call canon law, from the system. And this creation of canon law as a specialized, separate body of law, separate from civil jurisdiction, was, according to Harold Berman, the historian, revolutionary, because it reintroduced systematic law back into Western life. It became something like the first modern legal system, in that it created a class of specialist canon lawyers whose sole purpose was to administer a rationally constructed, systematic body of law, rather than a mere collection of written customs, which that's mostly what law was in the early Middle Ages. So revolutionary in that point. Excuse me, in that sense. It's also influential because the influence of papal theories of government, because what effectively the Pope is doing, what the reformers do, is they assert the sovereignty of the papacy over the church. Now, the idea of sovereignty, the idea that one ruler has the final say over the whole church, is something that goes back to Roman law, but it's going to create a really sharp, highly refined view of sovereignty, which in the later period, when you get to the Renaissance, kings will begin to formulate their theories of rule, of divine right, essentially against the claims of popes. Which basically naturally conflicted with them. In other words, modern theories of government owe something of their origins to medieval disputes over papal authority, because its claims were so far-reaching. And in their most extreme forms, by the way, don't really reach until you get to the 13th, 14th century, and they're nuts. In fact, there was a man named Giles of Rome who wrote a work called I think it's on I have it on my shelf somewhere, ecclesiastical power, which was sort of the height of this assertion of medieval authority. Basically, again, it kind of flows from what things that some of the supporters of Gregory VII were saying, that because he was the head of the church, he was the Pope, was ruler of the church, because he was the ruler of all lay Christians, he's the ruler of the lay world, that effectively says that he's the ruler of the entire world. And in fact, the subtitle of I have an Latin-English translation of that work. The subtitle of that book is A Medieval Theory of, I think it was called Global Government or something like that. It is kind of like that in its extreme form. So it's a massive, I don't want to overdo this. We'll get this in, I'll make a caveat in a minute. I don't want to overdo this, because when I say it's a big institutional assertion of authority, again, compared to modern states, the medieval papacy is nothing. So in terms of degree, it's not maybe as big of an institution as we think it is, but for the time, the assertion is kind of new in a lot of ways. The other thing, of course, that happens here, and I've already hinted at this, is this idea of the clergy as a superior order, this reforming spirit that the that first the Benedictine reformers and then the Gregorians themselves really adhere to. This idea takes hold by the mid 11th century. The papacy, catches this reforming spirit, and again, the idea is they want to separate the church from the world, even though they're in it. And again, this is why you want the separation of, and this sounds weird in some ways. One of the big things about this, about getting rid of married clergy was not, partly it was sexual in nature, by the idea of sexual impurity, but also to free itself from the cares of the world, right? St. Paul says, someone who is worried about their wife is worried about the affairs of the world, not the affairs of God. Those two things are really important to these reformers. And in fact, this amounted to a reshaping of all society when they did this. Even before the reformers, in the 9th century, there emerged this idea of the three orders in France. This is the idea that there were three orders to society: those who worked, those who fought, those who prayed, and that the third order was the most important, right? Because it was sacred. It was sacred, and therefore its character shouldn't be tainted by impure activities. By the way, one of these activities was war. Again, this is a monastic idea. Monks like peace, tranquility, and these big barbaric, feudal kings are basically When I used to teach feudalism to my Western Civ classes, I explained it as a theory of government in which big guys with swords run things, and these monks didn't like these big. It seemed impure to them, and this is and they basically enshrine this idea that the clerical estate was a superior way of working out one's salvation in comparison to the lay estate. And then, by the way, this had always been asserted with regards to like celibacy or monasticism had always been seen as the ideal, right? The ideal way. Most people couldn't do it, so it was okay. What's new here is the sort of attachment of this monastic ideal to the secular priesthood, taking the monastery into the world. And again, and sort of trying to impose that essentially on everybody, which is what led to all these things that happened. This is much later on, but you get to there's a series of Lateran councils of the Lateran Basilica in Rome in the 12th and 13th centuries, where popes would codify a lot of the beliefs that stem from this idea. One of these, of course, is clerical celibacy for priests, which is made mandatory in the 12th and 13th centuries, again, to prevent the handing on of church offices to relatives and those sorts of things, but also to improve the moral lives of the clergy. Marriage was confirmed as a sacrament, an indissoluble union, conferring sanctifying grace upon those who enter into it. It makes clear, by the way, the voluntary nature of the bond as well. It can't be forced. Again, this is important if you're wondering why that's important, by the way, is so you can't force people to get married. So it's meant to sort of separate the church from these. When we say family ties, when I say family ties, I mean family ties kind of like The Godfather. Like literally, when I say families, when they don't want families passing on church offices or buying and selling them. We mean these noble families, which have kinship networks which extend everywhere, and so they're trying to sort of curb that. And this is where you get claims to where levels of consanguinity come into this as well. So you're getting this. You're shrinking the notion of family so you can get control of the church and its property away from these nobility and these kings. It also, of course, the Lateran councils enunciate the doctrine of transubstantiation, but effectively they make effective papal claims to govern the church and legislate for it, to claim and exercise authority over it, but also enshrine these ideals about the clergy as well. The other thing about these, if you wanted to put it this way, this growing clericalism of the church, was, I mentioned this before, Gregory VII actively encouraging laymen and lower clergy to undermine bishops who thought they were tainted with corruption. And his assertion of a right to depose monarchs. These were really subversive things. You could I think you could say some of these things are morally dubious, even if they can be justified by very extreme circumstances. One of the things that's going to happen later on in the Middle Ages, because, of course, these high-minded people like Gregory VII, for the most part, he was just concerned about, the church, its authority. Later popes who are not as high-minded will abuse these things. And this will gain the papacy a reputation for subverting the civil order in the later Middle Ages. This will actually feed into the Reformation and become a justification for it. And then finally, just to put all this in a bunch, okay, so you have this reform movement, the Gregorian Reform movement, which is successful. It reforms the clergy. It does more or less raise the. It's never perfect, by the way, the behavior of the clergy in any age, but it does more or less do this by the middle of the 12th century. It does more. I say more or less, never totally, and these kings still have a lot of control over the church and their territories, but it does free them from the most egregious impositions of lay influence. And then finally, of course, it is magnificently successful in reasserting papal primacy. That's why when you get to the 13th century, Innocent III, probably the sort of ideal papal ruler of the Middle Ages, can say things like, and I'm quoting here, quote, "We do not intend to judge concerning a fief, but to judge concerning sin, of which judgment undoubtedly belongs to us, and we can and should exercise it against anyone," unquote. Can't get more baldly assertive of your authority than that. So it was a success. But like any reform movement, it has excesses and errors, and you can still think that the results were worth it. And I do think the results in the short term, a couple centuries, so it worked. It was a successful reform movement. But you could make the argument, and in the long run, it came at a great cost. The growth of the church's legal system. And to give you an idea, by the way, of how much canon law dominated the medieval church, most medieval popes were not theologians. They were canon lawyers. Because most of what they did was hear cases and suits and stuff like that. The growth of the papal machinery of government, right, took up more and more of its time, more and more of its finances. It also meant, by the way, the growth of the curia meant that prelates of the curia, who they're kind of like the papal court, they're kind of like the counterpart to a secular court or a monarchical court. They're his representatives, right? Going and treating with kings. They come to live in splendor, a lot of them. Some of them already had. But they do this partly because they have to treat with princes on an equal level. And that's actually right, by the way, because these kings weren't impressed with people running around. We're going to talk to a hermit living in a pigsty somewhere. That means, of course, the church, ironically, gets more and more involved in these worldly things. And then finally, and this is something, again, was not intended by the reformers at all. They wanted to make the clergy holy. But by ingraining this division between clergy and laity based on legal status, it tended to sort of override the whole idea of, not override it, but it'll come to sort of, blur the idea that holiness of life is the important thing, you could say. And so, again, it led to problems later in the Middle Ages. It probably fed into things that led to the Reformation. So it definitely came with some costs and benefits. It came with some costs, even at the expense of all the benefits. One last thing I want to say about this, one last caveat about the Gregorian reforms, because we tend to emphasize, what a shift it is. And I mentioned Gregory VII, making all these arguments about the papacy. It's pretty funny. The New Catholic Encyclopedia mentions that, on referring to Gregory VII, the man who gives his name to this reform movement, he was very sparingly referred to in sources before the Reformation. He's kind of forgotten. He's not really this key figure as we think of him today in a lot of ways. A lot of historians do. Until the Reformation, when interest was revived amongst Protestants and Catholics. Presumably, by the way, because they're reading back into him all the things that happened afterwards, which he didn't necessarily, he wasn't you can't predict what's going to happen 4 centuries after your death. So, and that's why, by the way, he wasn't canonized until the 17th century, actually. And I think that's because, again, we can sometimes, because it was such a shift, it seems like, the church became this gigantic bureaucracy, with Gregory VII. Not really. Not as much as we think. And we kind of overdo that stuff when we think about this. Because, again, this gets into all sorts of things, right? Complaints about clericalism, complaints about legalism of the Western Church. You can kind of overdo it. I think it's much more understandable in the context of the time. but probably did have some unintended, as most things do in history, some unintended consequences that maybe don't seem as good in the long run. And so that is it. That is the end of this episode. Couple of things. Last notes before I let you go. Be at least one more sort of short episode coming. This is an episode everyone should be able to hear this. This will also be the next one. Will also be for all people, not just subscribers, not just patrons. And very soon, probably within the next week, the next episode on our series of Latinization. To which, by the way, this is a little bit this episode's kind of background. So, because in that episode, I'll talk about Gregory VII's efforts to reform the liturgy, which he did do that. And then, before then, I'm actually going to release the first episode of Latinization for everybody as well. So, you're a patron, you've got stuff coming. And if you are not a subscriber yet, not a patron, you'll have stuff coming anyway. But with that, please do go to Facebook page and like that. Please subscribe on YouTube if you haven't. If you don't listen there, it helps me. I'm trying to monetize the channel. So I need to get to 1,000 subscribers. So please go do that and encourage people to do that. And also on Spotify, you can go check that stuff out there as well. Go listen there or anywhere else, Apple Podcasts, places like that. Those are all there. Visit churchcontroversy.com, my website. And I just published another essay in Crisis Magazine. It's kindly published that. And essay on the German synodal way. So all of the goings on in Germany at the moment, kind of controversial stuff there. So go check it out. And and if you like what you hear here, go leave a comment on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. I'm trying to put up more polls and stuff so you guys can interact with me. Oh, that's the other thing. Yes, at some point in the near future, I'm aiming for the end of the month. I am going to announce. I'll announce it before then. Try to get some interest in this, but I want to do a live stream with y'all. You guys can ask me questions about any recent episodes. Stuff at Crisis I've been writing, any events in the church or whatever you want to talk about, basically. I'll propose a topic. We can talk about whatever you want. But that'll be coming soon as well. And that'll be one for all listeners, not just patrons. But, oh yes, and if you do feel like, if you like this, think this is good stuff, go and please, if you want to become a patron, please go over there and think about that. It would help grease the wheels a little bit here. Again, I'll repeat this. I'm not trying to make a living at this, but always helps. It's a way of showing appreciation, and it does get you motivated. So, last of the public service announcement. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I really appreciate it. Humbled by you guys turning into the podcast. Hope you guys got something out of it. Hope you guys are having a wonderful and blessed, happy week. Blessings to you all, and my prayers with all my listeners. Have a great week, you guys. You'll be hearing from me soon. Take care.